Good afternoon, everyone. Kwe, sehogon, bonjour, and greetings. Welcome to Heritage Talks Online. My name is Dwayne Wilkin, and I'm here with Allison Kirkwood, who is running the Zoom controls and live streaming today's lecture over the internet. In reality, I am situated in unceded territory of Wabanaki First Nations territory, along the St. Francis River, called Arsagantakuk in the Abenaki language, and I invite you all to think about the ancient and ongoing Indigenous presence wherever you live too. Today we delve into the history of Indigenous communities who gathered along the St. Lawrence River in the first decades of the French regime to form some of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in what is now called Quebec. Our guide is the historian and curator Jean-François Lozier, author of the 2018 book entitled Flesh Reborn, the St. Lawrence Valley Mission Settlements through the 17th Century. Before we get started, I'll say a few words about the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network for those who may be joining us for the first time. We are a nonprofit association dedicated to lifelong learning whose supporting members include historical societies, community museums, archives, libraries, and cultural organizations. We are also supported by individual subscribers who receive our quarterly magazine, Quebec Heritage News, the only English language publication of its kind in Quebec, featuring stories about history and heritage in diverse communities around the province. You can find more information about Quan on our website, www.qahn.org, and please consider joining with a paid subscription. Your financial support helps ensure we can continue to offer learning events such as these. In return, we'll keep you in the know about upcoming talks, conferences, exhibitions, workshops, and special publications. Today is a great day to join because Quan is offering first-time members a 30% discount off the usual price of a one-year membership. That's just $20 for 4 issues of Quebec Heritage News. Message me or Allison in the Zoom chat box or by Facebook Messenger to claim this offer, which is valid only till the end of today's lecture. Finally, I would like to thank our major donors who also make this series possible: the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Zeller Family Foundation, and Townshippers Foundation. All of our heritage talks are recorded and archived on Quan's Facebook page. This is a public site, so you don't need to have a Facebook account to watch any of our past talks. Now, a quick word about technology for those of you on the Zoom call. Please be sure to mute your audio and turn off your webcam while Jean-François is presenting. This is to help minimize transmission problems for viewers in regions with limited internet. You are welcome and encouraged to turn your webcam back on after the presentation during question and answer period. Speaking of which, I invite those of you joining by Zoom to click the raise hand icon in the bottom of your screen. If you have a question or a comment you would like to share, you can also write your questions and comments in the Zoom chat box or on Facebook Messenger. It is a great pleasure now for me to introduce Jean-François Lozier. In addition to being an historian and an author, Jean-François is curator of French North American history at the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau. His research focuses on Franco-Indigenous relations during the 17th and 18th centuries, as well as material culture, commemoration, and public history. Until I read Jean-François' book, I had no idea how First Nations groups undertook to experiment with new, more sedentary lifeways alongside early French colonists. Moreover, I never considered the extent to which Innu, Algonquin, Wabanaki, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples negotiated and shaped this process. Indeed, one of the outstanding contributions of Jean-François' narrative is that Indigenous figures, leaders, warriors, and diplomats such as Miretsu, Negamat, Manitouguash, Kapitanal, Etenechcoat, Teganasorans, and Tataquiseri, to name but a few, take their rightful place in this history alongside French missionaries and colonial administrators whose deeds tend to dominate accounts of the period. Flesh Reborn won the French Colonial Historical Society's Mary Alice and Philip Boucher Book Prize and was shortlisted for the Canadian Historical Association's Best Scholarly Book Prize. It's published by McGill Queen's University Press Welcome to Heritage Talks Online, Jean-François.
Thank you, Dwayne. Thanks, before anything else, to you, to the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network for this enthusiastic invitation, for everyone in the audience, everyone who will take the time, either on Facebook now or on Facebook at a later date, to engage with this subject matter that I think is thoroughly interesting and worth exploring in this era of reconciliation. Or rather in this era where we strive towards this ever-elusive reconciliation. So I will share my screen and start a PowerPoint in a second. Here we are from the beginning. So what you're seeing is the cover of the book that Dwayne kindly mentioned. This is a book that was the product of my doctoral work and work after, and so a project on which I spent a third, perhaps, of my life, waking and sleeping hours. So something that's kept me very busy then and very busy still nowadays, even though the book is a few years, 5 years old, because there is still so much to discover in fragments that one happens upon through research or by happenstance, and around this book that is focused on the 17th century. So I'm entertaining the project of having a kind of a second volume on the history of these Indigenous communities through the 18th century. But let's start, as I've started in the book today, with the 17th century. The main argument here is that Indigenous peoples are central to the history of the St. Lawrence Valley. Why does this argument matter? Why is it an argument that deserves to be made, given that on the surface of it, in this day and age, when we recognize Indigenous peoples as having been important in the past and being important nowadays? Well, it's an argument that deserves to be made and remade, because if you pick up the average history book, Canadian history book, Quebec history book, the St. Lawrence Valley is portrayed explicitly or implicitly as the heartland of New France, so of a space of French colonial settlement. It's often portrayed as well, for better or worse, as the precursor, as the foundations, the cradle of French-Canadian Quebecois society as it exists to this day. That is an entirely fair way to approach this St. Lawrence Valley in the 17th century, for this the good reason of demographics. By the end of the 17th century, the French have outpaced Indigenous peoples in numbers in this space. They founded Quebec, the capital of what would become, what grows during this period into a continent-wide colonial empire, a loose empire, but colonial empire, or sphere of influence nonetheless. And so by the end of the period, the French are numerous, and there is no doubting that this St. Lawrence Valley society becomes the cradle of French Canada and of Quebec. That said, this is what we call in history a teleological perspective. That is to say, a perspective where you tell the story in light of the end of the story. Because if any of us were to be teleported at any point in the St. Lawrence Valley through the 17th century, it would not have been clear by any means that the French would come to dominate. In the early parts of the century, the French don't represent a demographic and numerical majority. That's that. But even as their numbers grow and outpace those of Indigenous peoples, if one considers politics, if one considers diplomacy, if one considers warfare, if one considers the economics that allowed this colony to, this French colony to survive and to eventually thrive in the St. Lawrence Valley, which were the economics of the northeastern fur trade, Indigenous peoples were central. So put one way, the book and part of my career is about placing Indigenous peoples at the center of this 17th century early Canadian history. But put in a perhaps better, more accurate way, my aim is not so much to place them there because they were there, but rather to recognize and to tease the sources that allow us to recognize this. So I'm hoping, we don't have much time today, I'm hoping that some of you might get a taste for the subject matter and go get a copy of the book, get your libraries to order copies, but there are other ways to learn about this history. This book is not the be all and end all, and there are great researchers out there. So piquing your curiosity is my key aim here. One of those great researchers is Darren Bonaparte, whom I know presented something to your network 2 years ago, perhaps, about wampum belts. I can't compete with his dynamism or his collection, but I will nonetheless use a wampum belt as hook as we enter or as we move along in this subject area. This is a specific wampum belt. It is one, unfortunately, not in my museum's collection at the Canadian Museum of History. Rather, it's at the McCord Museum. It's been there for over a century. But it is a belt that is remarkable. I didn't research and write the book having this belt in mind, but once it was researched and written, it occurred to me that this belt embodied so much of what is going on, what I see going on in the 17th century. What is going on in the 17th century? Well, first, perhaps a few words about wampum for those who might need a refresher, or for those who are being exposed to this type of material culture for the first time. Wampum are beads. Here's a close-up of this belt on the right of the screen, and beads, modern beads, and the shells from which they were made on the left of the screen. What is fascinating about wampum is the way in which it embodies cultural creativity, social innovation in the North American Northeast in the 17th century. What do I mean by this? I mean that this type of object is one that we interpret that goes without saying that it's an Indigenous object, but it's an Indigenous object created in a context of intercultural exchanges. What do I mean by that? Well, shell had been prized as a material before the arrival of Europeans in the early 17th century. And so shell beads are documented in the accounts of early European explorers, in Indigenous oral narratives, and on archaeological sites in great abundance. But these shell beads tended to be wider, flatter, disc-shaped, not these tubular beads that correspond to what we understand as wampum, and what through the 17th century came to be the basic shape of wampum. Why this shift? Well, because to create these little tubular beads, you need the technology for it. And so metal awls imported from Europe, appropriated by Indigenous peoples, and by some Europeans who dabbled in this craft as well, were what allowed for the changing shape of these shell beads. Now, shell beads appear to have had a political and diplomatic role and importance since well before the arrival of Europeans, we might say from time immemorial. But in this context, the 17th century context of upheaval, of epidemics, of increased warfare, of intercultural diplomacy between Indigenous peoples and Europeans, but among Indigenous peoples themselves as well, these beads became an embodiment of value, not insofar as they were money, as the earlier 20th century non-Indigenous scholars took them to be, but rather because these required considerable labor to produce. One, you have to drill them, you have to shape these little beads. out of quahog, which is the shell with the purple, and whelk for the white ones. That takes time. But you also have to transport them, because these are shells that are from ocean mollusks that one finds off the waters of New England, New York, so Long Island, and vicinity, Cape Cod as well. So these objects had to travel as well. That is labor, it's work to weave them into strings, and even more to weave them into what the English called belts, but the French called colliers. They were neither belts nor were they collars, necklaces. They were something perhaps closer to banners. In any case, the point here is that to weave them, to design something like what you have at the top of the screen, required further labor. So these came to be used as material support for political exchanges, diplomacy in the Northeast, including between the French and their Indigenous allies and their Indigenous enemies. The mechanism at work was that, well, what was exchanged orally, the pledges, the agreements, the statements were backed up by this valuable object, which could then serve as a mnemonic device, so be kept within a community to be brought back and read, so to speak, periodically to rekindle the memory of the pledges that had been made by one's community, by a family within one's community to another, or by a community on the outside. So this sealed agreements, sealed treaties. This particular belt is wonderful because it speaks to the processes that brought people together in the St. Lawrence Valley. So movement, you've got those beads moving, but materials are not the only thing moving around in this very dynamic period. Peoples also moved around in a dramatic way. And there's a bit of a jarring effect here in the popular imagination and collective consciousness that tends to exist about Indigenous peoples as fixed, as localized, in opposition or in comparison with Europeans, who were the ones crossing the Atlantic, moving around, expanding across the continent. Well, Indigenous peoples moved around to recombine themselves as a way to survive, as a way to thrive in a time, as I said, of upheaval, of social destruction and social reconstruction. So I use the term in the book, mission settlements, because I like the word settlements. And this, since I'm speaking to the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network, I think this is a good opportunity to make the point that there is something to be said for the merits of doing history, any art or any discipline, in different languages, struggling with issues around translation. I am a Franco-Ontarian. I work in French, in English as well. This research evolved almost on its own out of a dissertation at the University of Toronto. So that's why I crafted it in English. It was also the idea of the possibility of it being read by descendants of the communities described in the book, many of these communities being mainly Anglophone nowadays, but also the possibility of engaging with scholars in English Canada, in the United States, who've been doing interesting work for decades on Indigenous societies and movement and networking and reconfiguration. So I was trying out some ideas, techniques out of ethnohistory, which is the name of the discipline that for decades has tried to, has done what it could to blend the insights and the sources of history. So documentary records, tragically generally produced by Europeans, with the conventional sources, approaches, and preoccupations of anthropology and ethnology. So ethnohistory has been kind of the driving discipline inspiration for this project. And this approach invites us to read between the lines, to read across the grain of the conventional sources. When I say conventional sources, I mean things like the Jesuit relation. So those accounts by French missionaries through the much of the 17th century who describe their travails among Indigenous peoples. Well, these are centered on the missionary experience above all. But, and I'm not the first to recognize this, but if you read through them and similar sources looking for Indigenous experiences, Indigenous perspectives, you find a whole lot of things that the missionaries themselves, these chroniclers, say on the subject. You find a lot of things that they were not trying to say, but that they end up saying, sometimes through omission, sometimes explicitly and unwittingly. And so what does this approach or this mindset, what does centering the history of the 17th century St. Lawrence Valley on Indigenous peoples look like? Well, one finds a great diversity. I use the term settlement back to this point about doing research in English and writing in English. Settlement does not have a good equivalent in French. The French called these missions, these villages, these communities. They weren't all villages. Some were similar to seasonal encampments. Settlement has the advantage as a term of evoking sites, community gathering points of different forms. It also gets us thinking about the way in which most of the Indigenous peoples who are living in the St. Lawrence Valley by the end of the 17th century did not have ancestors who had been living there in the early part of the 17th century. The short version of this story is that the first of these mission settlements or mission villages or mission community was founded in a site that the French called Sillery, now within the broader greater Quebec City, right here to the top right corner of the map. Let's see whether I can get a pointer, laser pointer here. Let me laser point it. So this became a site first where missionaries engaged with the Indigenous peoples who had been living in and around what would become the trading post of Quebec City, the compound, and then eventually the colonial capital. These were peoples that the French described as montagnais. We might describe them as Innu nowadays, as that is the term used by from the 19th century onwards by the descendants of these peoples. But looking at the sources, we find that there is some great linguistic diversity, and things are not nearly as straightforward as the French think that they are, as the writings of the Jesuits have allowed historians to believe that they are. So Sillery attracted not only montagnais or Innu from the immediate vicinity, but some from the Saguenay, some from the north shore of the St. Lawrence. It also attracted peoples whom the French called Algonquins, who referred to themselves as perhaps as Anishinaabeg, which is the modern term, but the period sources suggest that many of them called, even though the French recognized them to be a different people, they called themselves Irini or Irinu, a word that in Algonquian languages writ large meant the same thing, i.e. human beings. So not surprising. So some of these people came from the vicinity of Trois-Rivières, from up the St. Maurice River. There were some Atikameks among these peoples. Some were from the Ottawa River drainage basin. So portions of the Indigenous populations in this broader St. Lawrence Valley converged on Sillery. It would have been a fraction of this Indigenous population, but it became the fraction of the population with which the French engaged most thoroughly. Before moving on to other groups, I would point to the fact that for those who are looking to do a bit of traveling this summer as the pandemic has been easing, a road trip to Quebec City and Sillery is an opportunity to go and visit the site of this earliest mission settlement of Sillery. And you will see the Jesuits' house. This is one built later on, while the Jesuits were still in possession of that site, but after the Indigenous community had dispersed, which that Algonquian community does by the end of the 1650s, 1660s. There is here as I'm highlighting a design on the ground that shows where the church was. There's a design as well that shows where archaeologists have found the remains, the foundations of the fortification. So that French infrastructure to the site is very present, and what gets a sense of what was there. But I'd say, and that's an argument in the book and an argument that I'll keep making as long as needed, there is a jarring effect when one contemplates this community, Sillery, with, let's say, Kahnawake or Kanesatake, Indigenous communities in the St. Lawrence Valley who are still in existence nowadays and thriving nowadays. And this comes from the fact that this community of Sillery was abandoned by its Indigenous population well before the 17th century was over, which means that in memory, it's remained very much kind of a mission, a site of French engagement. Sillery is a name borrowed from France. It was the name of the patron who never crossed the Atlantic but gave money to this mission. What's been lost, among other things, among our sense of what this place was, is the fact that for its Algonquins inhabitants, it would not have been Sillery, but rather Kaministikawaganshit. You won't see any sign around Sillery nowadays that tries to keep this Indigenous name alive, because it's a community that moved on elsewhere. Still, if we want to understand the 17th century on its own terms, it's worth unearthing from the sources some of these names and tackling with them. I wasn't the first to spot this name in old missionary sources, unpublished sources, dictionaries. Other antiquarians had done so and repeated the idea that Kaministikawaganshit meant where we fish the salmon, where we fish the eel. But linguistics matter, translation matters, and being committed to that principle certainly invited me to dig in period dictionaries, in later dictionaries of Innu, of Anishinaabeg, and discover that Kaministikawaganshit referred rather to the red sand, the red stone of the place. So digging deep in the sources is also an opportunity to correct things that good scholars, including very solid scholars, keep repeating because they don't take the time to go back to the primary sources and interrogate them with great curiosity about Indigenous experiences rather than merely missionary experiences. Time is flying by, so let me just zoom rapidly through a couple of other maps to give you a sense of the diversity that I alluded to. If the Algonquian population of Kaministikawaganshit relocates and disperses from that site by the 1660s or so, it's owing to several factors. So the pressure of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, who are making military inroads in the St. Lawrence Valley, but it's also because one of the foes of these Haudenosaunee, these Iroquois, found in the St. Lawrence Valley a site of refuge. So the Wendats, or Hurons as the French knew them, have to disperse from their traditional lands along the Georgian Bay, and some of them find a refuge close to the French. Why? Well, they have been dealing with French missionaries. Many of these Wendats have embraced the Roman Catholic faith, or rather their version of the Roman Catholic faith. It's also because the French are able to defend and contribute to the defense of their autonomy in the face of Haudenosaunee, so mainly Onondaga, Seneca, Mohawk onslaughts. These Haudenosaunee nations being very keen to not annihilate physically these societies, but rather integrate them and make them part of Seneca, Onondaga, Mohawk society. So some Wendats by the hundreds cast their lot with the French. And we see on a map such as this, I'll spare you the details, but that owing to a number of factors, that community moves around before settling to the site of Jean Lorette, which is today's Wendake. Why don't I label it Wendake on this map? Well, because it only came to be known as Wendake in the late 19th through the 20th century. Wendake meaning place of the Wendats. Rather, the Wendats for whom this became a new home called it Roreke. So a Wendatization of the French name Lorette. While some Wendats sought to escape the Haudenosaunee, quite a few of them were captured or turned themselves over to the Iroquois Five Nations Confederacy or League and integrated this society, which means that by the second half of the 17th century, a lot of the population of Iroquois in what is now upstate New York are what one might call new Iroquois. They are former Wendats, former Algonquins, former Sokokuis. They come from dozens and dozens of nations that were either vanquished or in the process of being attacked by the Haudenosaunee. And through the practices that historians have described as those of the Morning War and the adoptions that followed, much of this population integrated and became, within a generation or two, thoroughly Haudenosaunee, thoroughly Iroquois. Some, however, for a variety of reasons, relocated to the St. Lawrence Valley after 1667, when the French and the Five Nations Confederacy had concluded a peace that lasted a few decades. What we see in the image to the left is a drawing by a French missionary circa 1665 based on a Seneca pictogram showing two warriors returning with a captive from war, a captive who perhaps would end up tortured, but more likely than not would end up adopted and integrated within, and indeed welcomed and perhaps rising to a position of power in the adoptive society. So some, from the sources, one starts to understand that through the 1660s, 1670s, some of these new Iroquois who weren't quite well integrated within the villages of their former enemies decide to cast their lot in a way much like the Wendats had, but in peacetime decide to cast their lot with the French. And so they relocated to the area around Montreal. Now this, and as you can see from the map, their community communities rather, moved on a number of occasions, quite complex, but the short of it is that these are the population, or these are the ancestral communities that today are Gahnoage on the south shore facing Montreal and Ganesadage at the Lake of Two Mountains near Oka. This brings us to one of the thornier questions that historians, but people also mainly in the political sphere, cultural sphere in Montreal and vicinity have tried to tackle the question of whether Montreal is a traditional and ancestral Mohawk territory or not. I'd argue that the answer is a complex one and that the question needs to be posed otherwise. It's a complex one because it is clear that the Mohawks of Ganawage, Ganesadage, like those of the 17th century, had ancestors who had been part of what archaeologists call the St. Lawrence Iroquoian communities that lived in the 16th century on the island of Montreal. Whether it is precisely the same political community that moves through time, that is a harder case to make, but there should be no doubting that genetically and in terms of outlook, in terms of culture, there is a continuity there. The case can be made, the same case can be made about the Wendats being linked to the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, whom Jacques Cartier had met in the 16th century in the vicinity of Quebec. So in a way, these peoples are drawing closer to the French for economic, military, political, and religious reasons. We'll get back to religion in a moment. But they're also drawing closer to the French because this entails returning to a territory from which some of their ancestors had come. It's very messy. but it's awfully fascinating. And I'd argue that questions about recognizing Montreal as a Mohawk land when posed nowadays have more to do with, or rather in answering them, we have to think more about what we want for the present and the future than necessarily trying to find clear-cut answers in a distant past. So Algonquin peoples, Wendat peoples, Haudenosaunee peoples, who are themselves very diverse owing to the dynamics of warfare and adoption and integration, they're joined by the 1770s by Wabanakis, themselves very diverse Algonquin peoples from what is now northern New England, fleeing the encroachments of New Englanders, who were far more numerous than the French were and far less dependent on Indigenous peoples for their livelihoods. This is as good a point as any to probe another commonly held idea about the fact that this is something that one hears very often in Quebec and elsewhere, that the French were gentle colonizers. They were very open to Indigenous peoples in a way that the English were not. It's true and it's not true. It's true in the sense that, yes, concretely, there were fewer wars waged by the French. The wars were less disastrous. The French got along better with Indigenous neighbors than Anglo-American colonists did. But it's not because the French were somehow more civilized in their approach or culturally superior on that front. Rather, it has to do with the economics of it, the demographics of it, the military considerations. What do I mean by this? Well, demography meant the French were fewer than their Indigenous neighbors. They were far fewer than the English colonists who settled in North American parallels. So the French were never in a position to impose their will on Indigenous peoples, to displace Indigenous peoples. They had to compromise. Accommodement, accommodation was the name of the game, not just through the 17th century for the French, but into the 18th century as well. And it was for the British for the first few decades following the conquest. It's only with the late 18th century, 19th century that demographic balance changes. Economically speaking, the French depend, this is very true of the 17th century, they depend on the fur trade, which requires Indigenous hunters, which requires men to hunt, women to process the skins before they can then be shipped to Europe. This is not a sort of work that the French can or want to take on. And so they're very dependent for the economic survival of the community, of the colony on the goodwill of these neighbors. So Wabanaki peoples are similarly drawn into the French orbit. By the end of the 17th century, all of those points on those maps can be summarized by these five. There's a Wendat community at Loreke or Lorette. There is a Wabanaki community at Ariskantikuk, which is essentially what we now know as Odanak. Again, why is Odanak not the term to use in this context? Well, because Odanak means simply the village. It's one of those names that stuck in the 19th century and through the 20th century at a time when the Wabanakis were down to, there was the village of Wolanak as well, but Odanak was the key village for a population who formerly, including in the 17th century, had very many villages. So Odanak wouldn't have made sense as a label then. Ariskantikuk was the name of the river and so became the name of the settlement. There was a very diverse Haudenosaunee community at Kahnawake, which was on the way to becoming or re-becoming a Mohawk community as this great diversity of peoples found in the Mohawk language and Mohawk culture, something, a lingua franca, so a common language, a way to understand themselves. At Kanesatake, the case was similar, and we find right before the end of the century that community that had been built on the slopes of Mount Royal at La Montagne So the first Anishinaabeg was split. An offshoot went to Soto-Récollet, to the north of the island of Montreal. And these two communities, 2 decades thereafter, would recombine and relocate to their present location on the Lake of Two Mountains. So these communities, by the end of the 17th century, were still very much Indigenous communities. And that's where a term like mission settlement can be misleading. And that's where an object such as the wampum belt that I showed initially can be misleading. It points to where it centers a cross, a symbol of religion, as an element that bound together the French with their Indigenous allies. But it doesn't quite give us a sense of what that meant concretely. The core of the evidence, to my mind, demonstrates, there should be no doubt about it, that for most of the peoples who moved to the St. Lawrence Valley mission villages in the St. Lawrence Valley, religion and the religion of the newcomers, Christianity, Roman Catholicism, mattered. It was a way to understand the world in a period of upheaval. It was a way of cementing a relationship with the French. It was a way of cementing a relationship with other Indigenous peoples who'd been former enemies. So in the St. Lawrence Valley, Mohawks and Wendats who'd been former enemies became sometimes grudgingly, other times quite happily, friends and allies, who together found common interest with the French. And so these villages, this is one of the takeaways, remained Indigenous communities. They always had been Indigenous communities. Missionaries, even though mission settlement makes for a nice, convenient term of art to describe them, missionaries were few and far between in these communities. There was 1 or 2 of them, perhaps 1 or 2 French helpers. Otherwise, they numbered in the hundreds of Indigenous peoples. It was the missionaries themselves who learned Indigenous languages rather than vice versa. This image is a bit later, but serves to illustrate that. It's one of the classic images in the absence of an earlier image from one of the communities. This is of Kahnawake as seen from Lachine, so the island of Montreal. The artist took some liberties with the background. The landscape is not nearly this hilly. Dates to about 1730. What I would invite you to see is the way in which there is a missionary compound. The church, not the same church that's there. The presbytery is still standing nowadays. But otherwise, outside of a fur trading post right here, the inhabitants of this community were still living in longhouses as their ancestors had done for centuries before. We know from other sources that this remains the case until the end of the 18th century. Into the 19th century, a community such as this one would have spoken Mohawk rather than English, rather than French. So much of the transitions that we sometimes tend to take for granted, and that even in these communities are taken for granted, were late 19th century ones and 20th century ones. So one of the takeaways is the way in which these communities, contrary to the common idea that the history of colonization is one where colonizers pushed back Indigenous peoples who were forced or who fled in front of the steamroller, when in the case of the St. Lawrence Valley, quite a few Indigenous peoples saw that the way to maintain their communities, to reinvent themselves, to hold on to some traditions, to acquire new traditions, the best way of doing it was to draw closer to the French and settle among them, settle next to them. And paradoxically, this, as I said, was also a way to remain in a territory in which they had pre-contact era deep roots. Another takeaway, they haven't dwelled very much on wars, but another takeaway is that when one looks at these sources, scratching one's head, reading between the lines and against the grain, what becomes apparent is that the long history of this French settlement in the St. Lawrence Valley can only be explained in the light of these Indigenous communities, because the wars that the French understood as their wars against the Iroquois were not their wars against the Iroquois so much as the wars of the Wendats against the Onondaga, against the Mohawks, that were pursued into the St. Lawrence Valley in the context of which the French were collateral damage, I guess, would be the term of art. They were conflicts in which they were drawn. They were conflicts in which, from the perspective of the Haudenosaunee, the French were secondary to the Wendats, who'd been the long-standing adversary and who were the ultimate prize to be absorbed. And similarly, by the end, and this becomes the pattern in the 18th century, we find that Indigenous peoples residing in these communities formed France's bulwark against New England and New York up until the 7 Years' War. I've already spoken too long about this. Here's a zoom on these two elements that I want to leave you with. That, I hope, leaves us enough time for a few questions and comments, but certainly anyone hearing this now or in the future should feel welcome to contact me with any questions, proddings, or criticisms. Those are very welcome. It's part of the historical business to be critical of what's been written by other historians before, and it's only fair for historians like myself doing this work to be receptive and welcoming of critiques and new arguments and new sources. So back to Dwayne, and thank you very much to the audience for your patience. I will stop sharing my screen. There we are.
Wow. Wow. Thanks so much, Jean-François. Thanks for a fascinating, brief account of your research into this period of Canadian history that is often overlooked, and the important role that Indigenous communities played in the, I would say, the very early settlements of New France and Canada. I have a couple of questions for you, and I'm sure there will be others who have comments and questions for you as well. One of them is, in your book, you talk quite a bit. You talk at length about the processes that were involved in coming to settle in small groups at first, and not always permanently. There was some going and coming and going a lot. Can you explore that a little bit further? There was one community that you write about a lot in the book. It's now called Trois-Rivières, Three Rivers, but it was known to local groups as Métaraboutin. I don't know if that's pronouncing it properly. You have a fabulous map in the book, and you talk about some of the negotiations that went on with the French around settling that community. Anyway, I'm talking too much, but I wonder if you could explore that a little bit, that process.
Oh, sure. I'll start by saying, I'll try to be brief and start by saying that it's very complicated, and it varied quite a bit from one community to the other, according to the period of community formation as well. Because, as I hope to have made clear, these communities came from different political communities or different nations corresponding to different political communities, but also different linguistic groups, different cultural groups. So those first two mission settlements at Kaministikawag-Ganchit or Sillery and La Conception or Métabirroutin, which corresponds to Trois-Rivières, that one was shorter lived and not as well documented by the sources. Those processes of settlement involved a settling down that was different from what happened in the case of the Wendat and Haudenosaunee community formations, for the reason that the Innu and Anishinaabeg, or Montagnais and Algonquins, were in the 17th century hunter-gatherer, nomadic peoples, hunter-gatherer and fishing peoples, who did not have much of a tradition of agriculture. However, again, when one digs in the sources and refuses to accept the easy answers that have been repeated, what becomes clear is that some of these hunting, gathering Algonquians of the St. Lawrence Valley, with whom the French enter into immediate contact with the foundation of Quebec, had ancestors who had practiced agriculture or horticulture. I prefer using the terms interchangeably to avoid being dismissive of the Indigenous practice, as anthropologists have sometimes been. So some of these groups had told the French that they recall having ancestors, or that their grandfather had worked the land and had fields on the island of Montreal. Now, this coming from in the early 17th century, so someone from the Ottawa River Valley, can be interpreted to mean that part of these dispersing St. Lawrence Iroquoian were integrated among the Wendats, the Haudenosaunee, but that others integrated and essentially changed their subsistence modes in being integrated with Algonquin neighbors. And so in that way, what the sources allow us to see in the early part of the 17th century, in the formation of Kaministikawakanaskit and Metabirutin, is an Algonquin willingness to experiment with agriculture, something that they hadn't been experimenting with for one or two generations, but that had roots literally and metaphorically in their own cultures, not just in the culture of the French. Ultimately, one sees that it doesn't stick in the way that agriculture would for the Wendats and for the Haudenosaunee, who had agricultural corn-centered economies in their homelands before moving to the St. Lawrence Valley.
On that subject of agriculture, in your account and your reading of the sources, the earliest, or some of the early attempts at sowing corn and perhaps other crops near the French, where they had decided with the French to attempt settlement, these were not very successful at the very beginning. In that, I'm defining success as continually settling. What were some of the factors that might have played into the decision of these first groups to abandon the fields and perhaps come back a few years later? I guess what I'm getting at is that there is no cut and dry point in time when suddenly groups settle beside the French and these communities are settled for forever more. It was in your account, that transition is more rocky than that. It was there were tentative settlements. They disbanded, and then they came back again. And I think what I'm learning today from you, and you've made it very clear, is that actually religion was an important part of that. Is that fair to say that there was a pull centered on religion because it was useful in their communities' imagining of how they might continue to thrive and reform themselves? Today you've recentered religion, I think, more than I saw in the book itself. So
religion doesn't loom so large in the book. It's very present, but it's not central, partly because there have been these great histories of Haudenosaunee Christianity in recent years. For example, work on Catherine Orgaredi Tikakwitha and others that have shown us the way in which Indigenous peoples naturalized these outside beliefs and made them their own. So I wanted to go beyond religion and understand the subject more holistically, but it became clear to me that religion was a key factor. I think it's easy nowadays, in hindsight, in the early 21st century, as it was for historians working in the second half of the 20th century, to dismiss religion and to think that Indigenous peoples, that missionary work was destructive, was fundamentally opposed to Indigenous cultures. I think or to dismiss the depth of faith that Indigenous peoples that neophytes, converts may have had in the 17th century. I think that does a disservice to our understanding of the past and to the memory of these peoples. because the sources are quite clear that religion matters for not necessarily all of the people who settle in these villages, but for a core number of them. When I say the sources are quite clear, well, it's one thing when the Jesuits tell you that, oh, our Mohawk converts are very pious. You should take that with a grain of salt. But when you triangulate other sources and you find that Mohawk delegates from Kahnawake, so allies of the French, show up at various points in upstate New York, so Albany or Schenectady, and in their dealings, in their diplomatic encounters with enemies of the French, with people who are hostile to the religion of the French. Well, many or on a number of occasions, these diplomats described themselves and their communities as praying, i.e., Roman Catholic, and so the numerous nature of these testimonials that there is something, that religion does matter, coming from various directions, not just from the people who you would expect to put religion on a pedestal, is what I think allows us to draw conclusions on that. There's also, in terms of behavior, like part of the book project is about not merely taking people at their word, but rather seeing how through following migrations and through following individuals' life trajectories insofar as they can be followed, you can see that people very often put their money where their mouth is, so to speak, and follow up with actions on things that they say, or sometimes contradict with their actions things that they may say. And so I think it paints a very clear portrait. Of course, we can't transport ourselves into the minds and peer at the complexity of religious feelings and tensions that may have existed in these 17th century minds, but there's more than enough of evidence to show that there was something there.
Jean-François, I've invited people to, and I'll say it out loud, to turn their cameras on and their audio on. Allison, you may need to press a button for that to happen in order to ask questions and comment orally. But in the meantime, there are a few questions that have come in with comments. I'll try to get to them. First of all, Anne Jeffries comments that this is on one of the images you showed in your slide. In the final image, she says, there's no palisade around the longhouses, but there appears to be a kind of fencing around the French community. Is this simply the artist's license, she asks?
This is an awesome question around which I'd love to give you another talk right now, but time is fleeing. So I'll just summarize it by saying that the fortification of these communities is a fraught subject. In the 17th century, we find we don't have any image that is as lovely, but we find that missionaries or rather indigenous communities and missionaries are quite glad to work together to fortify these communities because the Haudenosaunee, the 5 Iroquois nations, or more concretely, the Onondaga and Mohawk represent a concrete threat. So having stone walls, as they did at Kaminista-Waganshit, or wooden palisades, as they did in an earlier location of this community that is back on the screen, this was a joint effort, something on which everyone could agree. With the Great Peace of Montreal of 1701, what happens is that the Haudenosaunee, they don't quite cease to be a threat. The French always fear that they will once again be a threat, but for all intents and purposes, the people, especially in a village like Kahnawake, are quite comfortable in the understanding that the Haudenosaunee of the Confederacy will not attack them, and so they do not bother fortifying their village. And when the French governors and officials start saying, oh, we need to fortify these villages in case the English attack, the people at Kahnawake, we've got good sources about this, say, no, we don't want any of this. So through the 1720s, 30s, 40s, because we don't want to lose our access to the river. Why build a wall when we're not threatened and when this will just be a policing structure that will allow the French troops to prevent us from trading with the English in Albany or from accessing the river in the way that we want to keep doing. So it's only very late in the game that, so when I say late in the game, I mean late in the French regime, that by the time of the 7 Years' War, the French really managed to convince and in a way impose their will on the people of a community like Kahnawake and have a palisade of wood built around the longhouses and a stone wall around a fort, essentially around the parish and presbytery and garrison. The little stakes we see here, as far as I can tell, is not not a palisade, but a fence to keep animals in from going and eating the community's corn. So,
Jean-François, because there are a few other questions and we're running out of time, I'm going to quickly try and jump to a couple more if you have patience. John Savage asks about the prevalence of intermarriage between Indigenous and French settlers in this period. I guess that goes in part to the question of, and assumes that he's talking about a Christian Roman Catholic marriage, but do you know offhand, was that a significant factor in the social life of these early settlements?
The short answer is that there is very, very little intermarriage between the French and the inhabitants of these villages. There is a bit, but we can count these unions, whether formalized by the church or illegitimate, on the fingers of a couple of hands through the 17th and 18th century. This is because the church discouraged it, not wanting Indigenous peoples to corrupt the French, and later not wanting the French to corrupt Indigenous peoples. So these populations are living close by, but they don't mingle in the way that you find fur traders, voyageurs in the late 18th century, 19th century, mingling in the West and giving rise to a Métis society. So that's the short answer.
Very, very good. Marie-Christine Bédard also asks about, she's invited you to maybe perhaps discuss or offer your knowledge on the origin or the reasons behind the disappearance of Indigenous people, the Iroquoian peoples who were farming maize along the banks of the St. Lawrence at the time of Cartier's visit in the early 1500s. We know generally about that from the records, but do you have any observations or insights as to who they were, more than you've already mentioned and discussed in your book?
Well, I'd say that those are the peoples I alluded to when I was mentioning the peoples that archaeologists know as St. Lawrence Iroquoians. So the peoples of Stadacone, Hochelaga, those were the two main villages described by Cartier. Those communities are not there, and that people are not there when Champlain returns or arrives in the early 17th century. The long-standing explanation is that these people had disappeared, but archaeology, coupled with oral traditions, in last couple of decades have allowed archaeologists, ethnohistorians to understand that this population doesn't disappear. It, for reasons having to do perhaps with epidemics, but more likely than not with climatic changes and the way in which the climate grows colder in the 16th century, which makes the agriculture or the culture of corn, maize more difficult. That appears to be the key explanatory factor for why these villages that Cartier had encountered dissolve and are absorbed, perhaps through warfare, perhaps through seeking refuge by peoples like the Haudenosaunee, peoples like the Wendats, but also Algonquins.
Thank you. Sarah Gauntlet asks, she has a two-part question. And this goes to your scholarship and your method, I think. First part of her question is, how do you include Indigenous and oral sources of historical knowledge in your research? And the second part of that question is, have you discussed this research with Indigenous historical scholars and community members? And how has their knowledge influenced or augmented your interpretation of the written record?
So this is something that was at the forefront of my mind when I set out my doctoral studies. because it's good ethnohistorical practice. It's good Indigenous studies to engage with Indigenous scholars, Indigenous communities. So this is a project that was very rooted in what I'd call the traditional ethnohistorical method, so not centered on these community engagements, but certainly there were opportunities that I found to discuss less with band councils, as I found that to be less useful than with individual researchers. This was crucial, thinking about how this influenced or augmented the interpretation. This was crucial, not so much in terms of oral history, because I found that the oral history that exists, the understanding of the past of these communities that exists in these communities nowadays, is arguably more influenced, or is the product not so much of an oral history going back to this period, as it is the product of what missionary teachers and what schools taught and wrote in the 19th century and in the 20th century. And much of what is understood, in, for instance, in a place like Kahnawake about, or much of what is believed about the 17th century past, it seems to me has more to do with late 19th and 20th century wounds and ruptures than it does with that distant history. I mentioned the way in which in the early 18th century, the people of Kahnawake did not want a wall to prevent them from having access to the river and that space of life and subsistence. Well, it's in the mid 20th century that the plowing through Kahnawake lands of the St. Lawrence Seaway ultimately did what the French could not have done in the 18th century. And that created bitterness of a sort that had not existed between neighbors in the 17th century. So I found the fragments of orality that I found most useful, the Indigenous voices that I found most useful, were the ones I alluded to that are reported by missionaries, but also by officials, French, English, Dutch, as well as fragments of orality that made their way into dictionaries, late 17th, early 18th century dictionaries of Indigenous languages in the 18th century as well. Since these were compiled by missionaries, so again, they have to be appreciated under that light, but they were compiled for the practical purpose of being understood, of understanding the peoples with whom they were trying to get along. So they end up telling you a whole lot about how things were conceptualized. Certainly being that sensitivity to language. So as a Franco-Ontarian, and I suspect it's the case for Anglo-Quebecers as well, one is finely attuned to translation as a challenge, to the risks of mistranslation, to the way in which ideas can be expressed in one language but not in another. So I had a bit of a sense, or it was something that that understanding was part of me, but speaking with and trying and failing miserably. I took a few classes in Oneida when I was at the University of Toronto, failed miserably, discovered the complexity and the beauty of Iroquoian languages, and so we'll have retained that at least, and discovered how much was there without retaining much myself. But so I think those engagements in our own time are ones that can spark questions that then orient the research in the past. So that's the short answer to a question that is an important one.
It's the short answer, but I think that you have opened up many, many doors to curious minds about this period and many new avenues for reading and research. I have to leave it there, and it's a good place to stop, I think. I thank you so much for being with us today. And I thank all of you who have joined us today and listened to this fascinating talk. I want to thank Allison for your technical support, and I will I will just say that our next lecture is on January 26th with the historian Jack Little. He will be examining and contrasting the social and political divide that characterized Eastern Townships settlements during the War of 1812 and later during the rebellions. More talks are coming in the weeks ahead. Please be sure to check out the entire Heritage Talks program on Quan's website. Thank you once again, Jean-François. And to everybody, until next time, be well and stay curious. Goodbye.